Maya Reynolds had fought against a broken system her entire life, but nothing could prepare her for the night she was arrested in her hometown. It wasn't just a simple traffic stop, it was a power play, a small-town cop's desperate attempt to remind her of her place. As the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, her mind raced, knowing this moment would spark a battle that could unravel everything she'd worked for. What would happen when the line between law and injustice was crossed? Could a single woman really change a town's deeply ingrained hate, or was she about to lose everything? Exercise was never fun. Sometime earlier, the town of Green Hollow seemed to exhale a heavy sigh as the summer sun began to dip beneath the horizon, leaving behind a warm, sticky air that clung to everything. The streets were alive with the rustling of banners being hung, the chatter of vendors setting up stalls for the upcoming community festival, and the hum of excitement that only small towns can produce. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, but for Maya Reynolds, the familiar rhythm of the evening felt suffocating. She drove through the streets, her eyes scanning the rows of historic buildings, but her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't the festival she was thinking about, nor the town's superficial sense of harmony. Maya had just left a meeting at the local courthouse, a meeting she knew would be one of many as she fought for the rights of families crushed under the weight of an unjust legal system. The weight of the cases she handled often felt like a boulder on her chest, but she bore it because someone had to. Green Hollow was a town that never quite knew what to do with people like her. The town's streets and their residents held both memories of progress and a cruel residue of regression. Maya had returned here after law school to fight the very thing that had defined her youth: racism. Her father, a quiet force of change in the town's civil rights movement, had been her first teacher, telling her that real change wasn't about changing minds in a day. It was about planting seeds that would grow into something meaningful. Yet even after years of work, she often wondered if her efforts were just whispers lost in the wind. As she drove past the courthouse, the imposing statue of a Confederate general loomed ahead. Even now, as banners for the festival fluttered in the breeze, the bronze figure stood stoic, a monument to a past that had never fully let go. Her eyes drifted past it, down the streets where families were laughing, unaware of the weight in the air. The heavy rain continued to fall downhill onto the crowded streets, stretching for the horizon. The soft hum of her car's engine was interrupted by the sudden flicker of flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Maya's grip on the wheel tightened. It was him, Officer Paul Hargrove. She didn't need to see his face to know. The man had been the town's enforcer of archaic values for over 2 decades, a relic of a system that thrived on control. Maya could almost feel his eyes boring into the back of her head as she slowed to pull over. Her heart quickened, but she kept her breath steady, trying to remain calm. She had faced this before, had faced men like him before. But that didn't make it any easier. As she parked and turned off the engine, she watched him approach her car in her side mirror. Tall and imposing, Hargrove walked with the swagger of someone who believed every piece of authority was owed to him, who couldn't fathom the idea of anyone questioning him. Maya inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, mentally preparing herself for what was coming. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "License and registration," Officer Hargrove snapped as he arrived at the driver's side window, his voice tight with the kind of condescension that was more than just professional. It was personal. Maya met his gaze, her eyes unwavering as she reached for the glove compartment. She knew this routine. She'd been pulled over more times than she cared to count, sometimes for no reason at all but to remind her that she wasn't above the rules. Rules that were bent for those who looked like her. Maya had always kept her composure, but tonight felt different. Tonight there was something heavier in the air. "Officer," she said, her voice smooth and calm, "what's the reason for the stop?" "Ran a red light back there," he replied, his tone dismissive, as though her question didn't matter. He already knew what he was going to do. "I didn't run the light," Maya replied, keeping her voice even. "I slowed down and there was no one else around. It was safe to make the turn. That intersection hasn't had a car in 5 minutes." She could feel his gaze harden, could sense the growing irritation in his posture as he stood there, eyes narrowing. He was looking for an excuse, something to justify this encounter, to make her feel small. "Do you think you can just make your own rules?" "Get out of the car," Hargrove said suddenly, his words clipped and forceful. Maya's stomach tightened. She had no intention of backing down. Not this time. She glanced at the empty streets around her, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes that might be watching. There were others in town who had been through this before, others who hadn't made it out with their dignity intact, let alone their freedom. "Officer, if you're citing me for a violation, I'll take the ticket," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But I'm not getting out of this car." His jaw clenched. There was no way in hell he would let her get away with defying him. "You're obstructing me," Hargrove spat, his words venomous. "Now get out of the car, or I'll arrest you." Maya's breath caught. She had been stopped hundreds of times before, but never had she been arrested over something so trivial. She could feel the injustice simmering beneath his words, the power he thought he had over her, the arrogance of a man who couldn't see beyond the badge. "But I'm not getting out of the car," Maya repeated, a steely calm filling her voice. "And if you arrest me, I'll be sure to make sure the press knows about it. I know my rights, officer. You'll regret this." That moment, her voice, not shaking but commanding, struck something in him. It wasn't the defiance he was used to from the usual suspects. He felt something shift, something uncomfortable. But his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. His face flushed, and without another word, he yanked the door open, his hand already reaching for his cuffs. He had the door open before the woman reached her entire life. "I said get out," he snarled. Maya had never been afraid of men like Officer Hargrove. She knew his type, had spent years studying their tactics, learning how to dismantle their arrogance with nothing but the law at her back. But as he roughly grabbed her arm and forced her out of the car, something in her shifted. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sharp sting of injustice, the overwhelming recognition of how this moment, this tiny, absurd moment, could escalate so quickly. The cuffs snapped around her wrists with a cold finality. She could feel the eyes of the town's residents on her now, even though they were too far to see. She could feel their judgment, their curiosity, as if she had somehow crossed an invisible line. This was supposed to be a quiet, easy evening, and yet here she was, arrested, for nothing more than asking a question. "Why are you doing this?" Maya asked, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of every injustice she had ever witnessed. "Because you need to learn some respect," Hargrove muttered, dragging her toward the waiting squad car. "People like you think they can do whatever they want. It's time to show you that's not how the world works." They reached the car, and the weight of his words struck Maya deep. He wasn't just arresting her. He was trying to break something inside of her, trying to prove that a woman like her, a lawyer who dared challenge the system, didn't belong in this town. As she was shoved into the back of the patrol car, she could see the other officers whispering to one another, exchanging looks. They were starting to recognize who she was. Maya Reynolds, the woman who had made a name for herself fighting against the very system they all thought they upheld. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Maya turned her eyes to the window, looking out at the passing streetlights. She knew this wasn't just about her. This was bigger. She told them that they should get in. By the time they reached the police station, the news had already spread like wildfire. The small town's gossip mill was never slow, but today it was at full throttle. Reporters were gathering outside, their cameras trained on the precinct's entrance. Maya sat silently in the back of the patrol car, her thoughts running wild, but her demeanor remained composed. She wasn't just a random woman in a holding cell now. She was the face of something far greater. She was the symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and everything that had to change. Inside the station, the officers buzzed with nervous energy, some of them whispering to each other in disbelief. No one had expected the town's favorite cop, Officer Hargrove, to be arrested for something as trivial as a traffic stop, let alone one involving a woman they all knew as Maya Reynolds. At the desk, one of the younger officers leaned in, recognizing her face. "Wait, isn't that Maya Reynolds?" he asked, his voice tinged with shock. "The civil rights lawyer?" It was as if a switch flipped. The smugness on Hargrove's face faltered, his grip on his power slipping as the weight of his actions dawned on him. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But instead of backing down, Hargrove doubled down. "Doesn't matter who she is," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "She's just another troublemaker." "Not..." Maya's voice rang out, cutting through the air like glass. "What matters," she said, looking Hargrove dead in the eye, "is that you crossed a line tonight. You thought you could intimidate me, but all you've done is expose your own ignorance. Failing the public won't help anyone." She was right. It didn't matter who she was. What mattered was that Officer Hargrove had made a mistake, and now the town would have to reckon with it. The news hit Green Hollow hard. What had been a quiet, sleepy town now felt like it was on the cusp of a reckoning. The media buzzed with the story, reporters flocking to the station, microphones thrusting into the faces of the town's residents. Maya's legal team was swift to intervene, and the charges were soon dropped, but the damage had been done. Hargrove was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched, and though he fought to justify his actions, the town's leaders were quick to distance themselves from him, the weight of Maya's reputation too heavy to ignore. As Maya stood before the gathered residents at a community meeting later that week, she felt the eyes of the town on her. She wasn't sure what kind of reception she would receive. There were still those who believed she was a troublemaker, but there were others who now saw her as a hero. "It's not about me," Maya said, her voice calm and sure. "It's about all of us. It's about the system that has been broken for far too long, and if we don't change it, we'll keep living in the shadow of the past." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling on every person present. The change was slow, but it was happening. And for the first time in a long while, Maya felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time it would be different.